President Biden told his audience at a fundraiser on Thursday that Putin was not joking when threatening the use of nuclear weapons in Ukraine. And that suggested that the world is facing, quote, the prospect of Armageddon for the first time since the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Military expert at Defense Priorities, retired Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis, says Biden knows that a nuclear war over Ukraine is possible and asks, will the president change course? The Lieutenant Colonel is here with us to weigh in. Welcome.
Thanks for having me. Glad to be back.
Yeah, great to have you as always. And we discussed this earlier in our show, how interesting it is to hear remarks from former President Trump recently talking about the desperate need to have peace negotiations between Ukraine and Russia. Meanwhile, Joe Biden has said repeatedly, we're as committed to this thing as long as it takes, even though, and I think you've said this on our show as well, it's inarguable that the risk of nuclear war is now greater than it has been maybe perhaps any time in the last decade, last 2 decades?
Oh, much more than that. I mean, this is one thing I certainly do agree with President Biden on when he said this is the biggest threat of nuclear catastrophe since 1962. And he's absolutely right. It's never been higher than what it is right now because you have both sides openly talking about it. You have Putin and many of his acolytes openly saying that if this, if our country is threatened, if our existential threat, if we feel like there's one, we'll use nuclear weapons. There's no question about that. And yet we acknowledge that tacitly, but then we continue on with these actions that feed into Putin's fear. And there is no good thing for us on that. Our continued going down that path doesn't make us safer. It doesn't make Putin any less likely to use it. In fact, it has the opposite effect. And I'm telling you, we have to change course somehow for our own national security interests.
Right. Let's play this out. Is the belief that Ukraine, with all of the funding and support of the West and the world, is going to militarily overcome Russia? Is that in fact the argument?
That is the argument. That's what a lot of people think. But look, you got to look at what's happening on the ground. Ukraine just spent the better part of the last 6 or 8 weeks having these two relatively successful, actually very successful in the north offensives, but they have now played out. They have gone as far as they can go, and Russia has now reaffirmed and stiffened. But Russia now has up to 300,000 more ground troops coming in. And as we've seen over the last 48 hours, missiles are continuing to rain in from Moscow, devastating the energy infrastructure throughout Ukraine, which is necessary for them to continue even fighting and moving troops around, etc. So the dynamic is going to continue to be going against Ukraine and improving Russia's strength. And that's just going to raise the stakes for everybody.
So how does Putin approach this? Because there's a difference, right, between Vladimir Putin being in some existential danger, or maybe there isn't. I guess, like your opinion on this, between Vladimir Putin as the chief administrator of the Russian state being in some kind of jeopardy because the war is unpopular, or maybe the people he's surrounded with don't like him. Long history in the Soviet Union of leaders getting it when things are not going well. And Russia itself being threatened, and the question: are those different things? And could Putin do something, reckless and world-changing because he not necessarily because of the position Russia is in, but that he himself is in personally?
Well, when you have an autocratic leader like Putin, it's almost impossible to disentangle whether his personal security or the nation's security are separate. I think that they're one and the same, especially when he is the sole decider on nuclear weapons. There is no committee or anything else like that, like there is in some places. He alone has the decision and the launch authority for nuclear weapons. So if he feels like he's being threatened, and I think I may have put this in that 1945 article to which you're referring, if Putin feels like that he's at risk of a 1917 style revolution to where he could suffer a palace coup or any kind of thing like that, he could then feel like he has to use the weapons. And of course, in his mind, it would be very easy to say, oh, well, this is for the national security of our country. We have to stop these attacks before they come. So that's entirely possible. And of course, we don't know how that dynamic is playing out inside. All we do know is that the risk to us, if that does, is bigger than anything we can imagine.
Yeah, the gamble does seem to be a lose-lose scenario. Either Russia succeeds militarily without bombs, in which case we're back where we started. Ukraine succeeds in regaining all claimed territory and pushing Russia completely out. Russia loses militarily and then feels kind of provoked into a nuclear response. And at that point, we're basically hoping that Russia doesn't feel as though, that Russia has the wherewithal or whatever motives to just say, okay, we lost this one, guys, never mind. And is that the kind of gamble that we're wanting to take on Putin's respect for populations, or his apathy, his lack of appetite for mass destruction, to not launch a nuclear bomb? That does feel to be like the line we're walking up to, and the presumption that we're making, that Ukraine can win the war and then that it will just be over at that point if the war is won on the ground.
It does appear, just from what people are saying and what we're doing, that is the presumption. And as I've said multiple times, and I believe even on your show here, is that in my view, there is zero chance, not even unlikely, but zero chance that Putin would allow his forces over any period of time to be physically driven out of all this territory, which he now believes is Russian territory, and him not escalate up to nuclear weapons. There's just no chance in my mind that he would do that. So I think that by continuing to have that as an objective on our side is to say that let's just push even closer to the nuclear threshold, which is absurd for our security.
I mean, if you think about the history of Europe, it's a history of long, sometimes 100-year struggles being fought over, small pieces of land that both sides claim, and they don't, they take forever to resolve, and they don't resolve. Then they go back. They fight over it again and again and again. And part of the triumph, right, of the modern era is getting out of that mentality where you have, nation states squabbling over territory, unending with just constant violence. Now it looks like Ukraine and Russia might be back in that dynamic where they are, Russia will gain and then Ukraine will gain, and they're basically squabbling over not the entirety of Ukraine, but over that eastern portion. How do what can be done to stop this from being like a conflict that just stretches on for years and years and years, and it's just barren, destroyed land, like in the trench warfare or something of World War I?
I was emphatic in the months leading up to this war that we had to avoid this very conflicting dynamic that you just described there, by having diplomacy and negotiating a settlement and everybody agreeing you can't get everything you want, no maximalist desires on any side, but both sides have to get something or we're going to end up in war. That now has happened. So now we can't go back to that other one. Now then the question is, what do we do now? And this is a critical question here. Should the United States risk the national security of our country, of all of NATO, over potentially getting dragged into a nuclear war over the eastern part of Ukraine? You said that very well right there. This is stuff that's been going on for, decades and in some cases centuries in different capacities on the same ground. And this is a squabble between Moscow and Kiev. And it's an existential and huge fight for them and very important to both, but not to us. And the idea that we could potentially lose American citizens, American troops, or American cities over something in the Donbass is just absurd on the face of it. And we definitely need to change policies.
Well, thank you so much for that. We always appreciate your commentary, Lieutenant Colonel.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
We'll have more Rising for you right after this.